Hello, everybody. So I think we're going to start again just now with our second keynote speech of the day. So I hope everyone had a nice lunch, maybe got to see some of the nice little spots out in Shoreditch. I was looking around myself, there were some nice little food spots, and me and Marcus were just actually talking about the street art and things and it looking really nice, but I hope everyone had a good lunch. So, as I said, we've got our second keynote today, and we've got another international speaker today who's come to the conference, and such a pleasure to have Marcus here today, and I'm going to hand over to them.
Thank you so much for this. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm quite jet lagged, and it's been a time here, but I have enjoyed very, very much being here with you all, being in this space. I was just telling Robin that it's super nice just to be in a space like this with all of you, hearing these thoughts, these ideas, so I'm really appreciative of that, deeply appreciative of that. And I think I also want to preface my remarks with two more quick things. First, that it's on the shorter side. It's only about 25 to 30 minutes or so. So we might actually get back on schedule with things, which would be nice. Just depending on the Q&A, we'll see how that goes. I can be really talkative sometimes, especially on topics like these. But the second thing, too, is that I am realizing that I am disciplinarily trained in a different kind of way than a lot of the presentations, which is not a bad thing at all. And I don't think anyone here sees that as a bad thing, but I do want to flag that for now, and just to note that I was trained as a literary scholar, philosopher, critical theorist, so that is very much a part of this talk. So I wanted to flag that as well. So we will begin with the talk. So this talk was hard to write. Usually I breeze through these kinds of talks, invited to speak about something well within my realm of presumed expertise. But this time, I was on the flight over here yesterday, still writing these words. This talk, in this place, under these conditions, cannot be breezed through. It requires intention, care, awareness, capacity, and indeed love. This talk was hard to write because transantagonism, my preferred term over but not against transphobia, is hard to talk about and think about and to experience. Because there is a deeply vexed affective state I and many of us are in, since we are also amidst union strikes and grappling with how our very presence here jives with being in solidarity, as we must always be, with workers and laborers, with the exploited and aggrieved, with those seeking to place demands on capitalism in whatever way. And also still, this talk was hard to write because I find myself always thinking about something else, something other than the violence, the harm, the oppression, which is a lie, but also not. It is a lie because how can one be trans, be allied to or an accomplice to trans people in politics, and not be moved to action and thought by trans antagonism? It preoccupies me all the time, and yet I'm here not to recount the ways that trans antagonism moves, though others will, and I support that deeply. That is simply not my aim right now, today. I'm here to talk about something else, and I hope that is okay with all of you. Part 1, Trans-Radicality and Abolition. I sent an abstract for this talk to the conference organizers, for whom I am immensely grateful for their generosity, their politics, their ethics, their care and consideration, their brilliance. Thank you, Sally and Natasha, Robin, Emma, and everyone else who put in labor for this symposium, which I know are a lot of people who I'm forgetting, but I do deeply appreciate all that labor, all that time. The abstract I wrote for this talk, titled Trans-Radicality and Abolitionist Politics, read as follows and consequently serves as a thesis for my remarks. To be discussed in this talk will be the utility of using an equally trans and abolitionist approach to combating trans antagonism, where transness names not simply transgender embodiment, but perhaps more robustly, a relational and ethical politics of non-normativity with respect to, and perhaps sometimes irrespective of, gender, and abolition names the cultivation of a life and livelihood whose emergence actualizes via the impossibility of violence. Trans-radicality and abolitionist politics seeks to enter into the conversation surrounding transantagonism via non-normativity and care. And when I began writing what you are hearing me say right now, which departs slightly from my intended abstract, as seems to always happen, I grew a bit intimidated. How to say such things in a way that will be affirming, life-giving, beneficial for those of you here with us today and beyond. And I still do not have a sufficient answer, but I will try nonetheless. My remarks today are that effort. When I say trans-radicality, I fear I might be misunderstood, assumed to be talking about our trans faves, Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera or Miss Major. At least those are our faves in the US, and for good reason too. I might be assumed to be discussing the seemingly never-ending litany of names slain too soon, but I am not quite doing that. When I say trans-radicality, the first half of this two-pronged talk, what I intend is a breach of the ways gender normativity pervades sociality, pervades how we are permitted to relate to others and ourselves. Gender normativity is a regime that circumscribes how we are possible to ourselves and others. Look this way and feel this way about the gender binary, yes. And also do your gender in this way and never that way. Ensure that others do their genders in this way too. And if they do not, punish and discipline them. And if you do not, punish and discipline yourself. And think sensible that others punish and discipline as well. You are only possible, only valid at the level of philosophical ontology if you do gender in these ways sanctioned by centuries of colonialism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and what is now understood as cisnormativity. This is the regime of gender normativity, of the gender binary, and trans-radicality serves for me as a departure from this. The emphasis on the political scope of this, to be a bit more clear, is not to imply that transgender people, those of us who are gender nonconforming or non-binary, or depart in whatever way from the genders we've been and continue to be assigned, must always, in our very being, be doing radical things. Folks of trans experience deserve very much to rest, to not have to defend ourselves at every turn, though we know this is crucial for our survivability. I don't mean to place an added burden on us. Rather, the distinction I make, lovingly so, for trans here as a prefix is one that opens it up to anyone doing a particular kind of work with respect to or with disrespect to the ravages of gender. It is, following the wonderful US scholar activist Kathy Cohen, not merely an identity that one possesses and that's it. Trans and its radicality marks a subversive relation to power that is moved in and out of, that is open and attentive to how we relate, and importantly to how we wish to create different kinds of worlds. I move away from typical definitions of radical, the etymological, going back to the root, toward, we might say, a more radical definition. Radical as an imaginative will to engage life unbounded. The radicality discussed in this talk is a mobilization toward what has not yet been realized or conceptualized, an imaginative speculation about how we might be, where we might end up, what might exist, and what might be possible. Radical and radicality denote a way of being unbeholden to normative constraints for legibility, politics, subjectivity, knowledge, and relationality. And if gender normativity is thought in the ways that I've described it, how then do we breach that in our transness? There's deep validity to the typical ways people combat injustices and fight against systems of oppression, policy change, protests and marches and the like. I, however, want to offer another way among these ways, a way that is perhaps quieter but no less loud, subtler but no less impactful. The kind of trans-radicality I want to propose is one that invites a different way of relating. That relation is one that encounters others on grounds of openness, refusing the foreclosure that is assigning gender or imposing an archive onto others before they even arrive onto the scene of the encounter. It is one that commits to the sociality of being and becoming other than what we've been said we need to be. I know these seem small, and they are, but I want to hope that they bear on how we feel with others, how we and what we think with and about others, because the smallest refusal of imposing onto someone else a pronoun might usher in the refusal to gender that person, the refusal to predetermine that person, and that right there might be the first time they felt truly, if only fleetingly, free in that matters. The latter half of the twofold titular meditation, Abolitionist Politics, is an attempt to amplify abolition in the context of transinsurgency. What I mean by abolitionist politics is a way of orienting to the world and others that seeks insistently to eradicate forms of carcerality and violence, a way of trying to be with others in ways that do not curtail their possibilities or dispose of them or punish them by violating the things they might want to be for themselves. Abolitionist politics, in short, tries to make the very framework of capture and punitivity nonsensical. It is not reactive against quote unquote bad prisons necessarily, but a way to make forms of carcerality impossible. Allow me, please, a quote from scholar Dylan Rodriguez. Quote, abolition seeks, as it performs, a radical reconfiguration of justice, subjectivity, and social formation that does not depend on the existence of either the carceral state, a statecraft that institutionalizes various forms of targeted human capture, or carceral power as such, a totality of state-sanctioned and extra-state relations of gendered racial colonial dominance, unquote. What Rodriguez provides me, and I think us in our politics, which is understood broadly, more than just partisan governmental politics, but politics as an insistence on how we wish our world to be and what we will and must do to create that world. That is how I'm understanding politics. What Rodriguez provides us in our politics is a demand to radically reconfigure what counts as work and agitation and imagination, what it looks like to live in a just society and world, what it looks like to be a valid being in person and subject, what is possible for how we move alongside one another, all of these things in a way that does not rely on carcerality. There are so many ways that the carceral limits what we are able to be. Of course, there are institutions that cage people on unjust grounds, detention centers and jails that deeply negatively affect queer and trans people. But there's also the carcerality of the gender binary, of colonialism, of our very ways of talking to and about people we care for. What would a world without even that be like for us? I want to begin from the vantage of the trans to imagine that, because I think we deserve it. Abolition is not one spectacularized event, but a constant working toward eradicating carceral logics as necessary for sociality and relationality. Like what Sarah Lamble terms everyday abolition, I offer abolition as changing the ways we interact with others on an ongoing basis in changing harmful patterns in our daily lives, questioning punitive impulses and relations of captivity. This is abolition in a broad sense, the making impossible and creation of a sociality indexed to the impossibility of carcerality, any form of captivity. We create abolition and do abolition. In each moment, we move toward the alleviation of subtle ways of curtailing the ability of anyone to become liberated. I understand and proffer abolition as putting pressure even on terms such as revolution. A prominent understanding of revolution, though not, of course, not the only definition or understanding, is akin to a seizure of the means of production. It manifests in taking or taking back the government or capturing the office of the CEO. Underlying this, however, is the assumption of an inevitable and natural government in office. Uncritiqued and simply taken for granted is the shape of power itself, which is implied to inevitably look like the state, by which I mean not simply government, but a horizon of stanched possibility and set of practices predicated on circumscription, order, law, and discipline, This state that is, as a relation inflected through punitivity, transaction, capitalist investment, and hegemony. How might we engender a provocation to care more than we can know, to extend our analyses past the ruins of the world and the discipline as we know it? We need not to know for certain the parameters of what comes after this hellish landscape. And perhaps we cannot know if we are truly to get to a place not beholden to existing modes of conceptualization. What is primary is that we care for and about one another's livelihoods. We then cultivate the condition that can lovingly accommodate such livelihoods. I'm not all that good at the practical and the concrete, being a critical theorist and being trained by philosophers, so I apologize for not providing a blueprint. But I do think that part of the non-concreteness is purposeful, and perhaps it is itself practical advice, that there is a way we can remain loose and unsettled, unsedimented as a practice of justice. That looseness opens up doors, in fact, unhinges the bolts on doors so there are no doors, and that is scary. But I submit trans as letting that door dissolve without a bouncer checking names, which means that whoever shows up will be let in unconditionally without conditions. The person who has identified as trans for 1 hour is included in this, as well as the person who is looking to learn more, who might have some gender normative baggage, but is nevertheless trying to leave that, as well as to the person who might not think too highly of departures from gender. Yes, the law might send agents to infiltrate our conspiratorial sessions, but I hope that does not inspire fear in us, though I know that fear is very real. Why would we let in someone or something that might harm us, especially in a space we hoped was safe? I suppose all I might say about this is that I want so very much to expand the people who love and fight and care and affirm and proliferate the possibility of us, which is, of course, us as well. So I am promoting, via an abolitionist framework, of refusing to dispose of anyone, refusing to say that someone does not measure up or say that someone is irredeemable, this non-exclusivity, because the very scary and risky possibility in that is that those who do not want us to exist might be moved to become otherwise, Because too, entering into the new world, the new mode of relating, means that whoever enters will not and cannot be the same. The relation touches them such that they are no longer the same as before they entered, and that shift can be everything. The trans might be precisely in its openness, the cultivation of the soil, such that it might be lush terrain for those who have not been permitted to arrive onto the scene. This can take the form of repetitively stylizing one's body in ways that deviate from regulatory expectations of continued gender alignment. It can take the form of refusing to others' frustration and discomfort, to assign genders to those who have not gifted you their gender identity, a radical self-determinative practice discursively manifested in that person, the person over there. Joan said that Joan did it for Joan's self. It can take the form of activism to stop the genital alteration of intersex newborns, or teaching trans histories, or declaring Black trans lives matter, or never shutting up about the coercive social construct of gender, or whatever other ways you can expose and puncture the heart of cisnormativity, handmade into sexism and patriarchy and heteronormativity. It is not about the spectacular and incendiary. Rarely is revolution and liberation brought about in such conflictory forms. It is about, as the late Toni Morrison has said, doing what you can where you're at. We can be bad at what they tell us is good for the good of the nation. Being a bad subject rebukes the tenets of and for the good of the nation. The nation and its attendant baggage of nationalistic boundaries and exclusionary practices is the very territory into which we are thrown, told to think of as the best, the proud and true, the land of the free. Respect its creeds, established long, long ago, venerate those who righteously uphold its constitution, have these bodily comportments, possess this set of genitals, chromosomes. Being bad at this, however, implies a deviation from the goodness that characterizes most subjects who behave. Being a bad subject then leans into a coalitional relation, a heeding of how our interrelatedness makes a claim on us. So if we are to be in coalitional solidarity with those who approximate transness as legible on the various corporeal registers of gender, this must place a demand on us to rebuke the inaugurative terrors of normativity, to become alongside trans. What I wish to articulate is a being with and alongside trans, an emergence into subjectivity through the disintegrating beck of transness as not necessarily specific morphology, but simmeringly mutinous unrelation to gender normativity. At issue then is not, quote, who is or is not really whatever, but who can be counted on when they come for any of us. The solid ground is loyalty and solidarity. Part 2, Care Toward No End. There is one thing the inimitable Jules Gill Peterson, a colleague and friend and comrade of mine, said regarding transantagonism that has stayed with me and that I want to think in light of and around. She wrote on Twitter, "Most transphobic discourse has a root form. Oh yeah, what about this easily falsifiable claim? The anti-trans strategy is largely a form independent of content, so we analyze the strategy, name it, and devote our energy anywhere but that content," unquote. She goes on to talk about the importance of care, that we may very well consume harmful and debilitating images and discourses, be encountered by those acts and discourses, and that is real and it matters. What matters too for us is how we care for ourselves and others, and how we open ourselves up to care. And that care looks like many different things, and it looks in many different ways. So I want the latter portion of my remarks to concern this. I want to be clear that the ways trans antagonism manifests are truly important to combat in myriad ways, and I wish not to sideline any of them. Indeed, part of the kind of care I will be discussing is about finding whatever way one and one community need to in order to live, to remain and continue to feel possible. That may look like any number of things, and even if it looks like something one's therapist might not think is ultimately helpful, I want to offer just a little space, a little breathing room for it to be, at least for now, okay. This being said, I want to carve out space for trying to think about the ways we might think through a politics of care as trans and abolitionists. Perhaps what this means is something small and simple and perhaps already known, but it bears being said nonetheless. The work of care happens all around us because care is necessary for our survival. We are fundamentally dependent and thus fundamentally interdependent. The work we do to keep each other alive exceeds quantifying and cataloging. How could we ever actually quantify the daily acts of care that circulate in the interspecies milieu we inhabit? Each of us, if I may quote another thinker, as is my practice, recognizing the places from which knowledge that I have comes. Each of us, to quote Hill Malatino, are doing essential work according to our relative and fluctuating capacities, that this work is actively aiding the flourishing of the other. Keeping count is futile and unnecessary. The rhythms of our care work are tied to the frailty or strength of our bodies, our fluctuating levels of exhaustion, the intensity of the demands placed on our time by other intimates, by our jobs, by advocacy work, by other dearly held commitments. The fantasy that care work within and beyond the home can be somehow equalized, a fantasy held dear by many feminists, myself included, ushers into the ostensible private sphere the same forms of neoliberal task tabulation that circulate unjustly in our waged labor. Why would we want that kind of accounting infecting our home places? Why would we want to import it to those other spaces of friendship, collectivity, and community solidarity that we co-constitute and on which we depend? But more to the point, why does this tendency toward mensuration persist even though we might understand that the care we perform and receive always takes place in excess of exchange logic, unquote, and that's from Hill Malatino's Trans Care. So when we care for ourselves and others, as we always do, always noting the ways that some people require different kinds of care and that many, including us, feel care differently, I want us to keep this in mind. Caring for ourselves and others when necessary is more than just a quantifiable act. It is a constant, always shifting necessity for our survival. I would think it has grown easy for some of us to see the transphobic form that Gil Peterson notes is endemic to TERF logics and responses. And maybe for some of us who are newer to all of this, it may not be so easy, but we know, or at least are familiar with, their playbook. Janice Raymond and Sheila Jeffries acolytes, J.K. Rowling fans and supporters. The things they say do real harm, and the things they say and think also precipitate other kinds of harm from others. It is not only these individual people who are bad because of the specific things that they say. More than that, the insidiousness of transantagonism, or at least one of them, is that such logics orchestrate how others move through the world. J.K. Rowling says one thing, and teenager across the ocean begins to build an intellectual and political framework around that, because that teenager admires Rowling, and then that teenager absorbs it, lives with it and by it, becomes indignant about its unimpeachable veracity and truthfulness years later when that thing has gone unchallenged. Perhaps teenager does verbal harm, or physical harm, or psychological harm, because that teenager's trans-antagonistic architectural building was not interrupted. And now that teenager is an adult with or without influence, with or without others who will be impacted by and respect and love them, having an effect. So care could look like compiling an arsenal of responses to the logics and to maybe sometimes content, with respect to my dear friend Jules, of trans antagonism. These responses are not for the TERFs or for the bigots. They are to affirm those trans folks who are watching, which can include us. They are for the folks who may be more timid and feel similarly, but are afraid that no one else will stand with them. They are for those who do not yet know that they are possible in and as and through trans, because all they've heard are transphobic possibilities. Our responses are for them, not the TERFs, never the TERFs. We are doing this for us and those who wish to be with us. And still, too, care could look different even from this. It can look like you and your friend in the living room, listening to music, playing video games, watching cartoons, loving on each other, or finding people to love on, making food, reading a book, writing poems, doing a workout. All these things, too, are forms of care. And we know this. I am telling you nothing new. All I want to convey with this is that these things matter. These things can keep us alive, or even if they don't keep us alive, and this is hard to say, but even if they don't keep us alive, they allow us to be, for a brief moment, a little free in the time we are here, and that matters too. All of this is in service of never stopping the work we are doing. This sounds exhausting, I know. We want there to be an end to the work, which is trying to put an end to suffering, and I want us to continue this. What I am talking about is refusing the presumption that we finish at a particular point. There is no and can be no end. To assert this might seem, and I want to flag here, a maneuvering into a slightly more academic citation style, which I hope is okay, as it permits me to think in a particular way that I'm trusting will be more beneficial for us than detrimental and annoying. But to assert this might seem to sidestep what Foucault claims in the preface of Anti-Oedipus, to be less concerned with why this or that than with how to proceed. Refusing to bank on the end is, at least in part, how to proceed. Quote, an abdication of political responsibility, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney write, anticipating the accusation. Quote, okay, whatever. We are just anti-politically romantic about actually existing social life, unquote. One's concern must be an ethical one that I want to submit, perhaps in supplementation to an oversight in Moten and Harney, not only sets its sights on social life that actually exists, but more substantively, fertilizes the conditions of possibility for otherwise and unsung and unknown emergence. There is no end because to know the end is to think one knows the totality of the landscape, a line of thinking that in fact cannot account for that which falls outside of the dictates of existential and ontological legibility. There might always be something else just outside, and we cannot foreclose the discussion when we think it is over. So there is no end in sight because sight is not the only sense available to us. There is no end in sight because our end may only be someone else's beginning, another's middle. Thus, our critical praxis, our interrogative social enactment, does something precisely when it commits to a political endeavor that is not in its own interest or the interests of the purportedly most marginalized. It is doing something when it commits to proliferating life where no life is said to be found. I am not someone who pedestals a mere remembrance of the dead, those who have met their deaths by anti-trans violence, nor am I someone who wishes only for trans people to be alive despite everything we might face. I am, in other words, as you might guess, not very interested in ends and endings, which is not to say that they are unimportant. It is to say that the end is not the point, not where the work is done, not where we are made aware of an injustice. What is unjust is precisely what precedes the supposed end. What is unjust are the terms of living, as Cameron Awkward Rich, Black and trans poet writes, quote, "There is something deeply unsettling, that is, to the insistence that someone ought to be alive in a world that did little to support that life," unquote, he says. And I feel that deeply, I do. And it is exactly this that propels me always to think about, mobilize around, how the terms of living might be cultivated such that they finally allow for not even only those who were barred from that social world, but even those who we didn't even know existed. And this right here is where I find my trans-radicality and abolitionist politics, making and insisting on a world that is cultivated for those we knew not yet existed, and we will love them. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really beautifully spoken. I have to say, I think it's really important as well, the part about like trans care. And I think it harks back to some of those things we said at the beginning about us just being together in this space, together and unified, can be seen as a form of trans care in itself, I would say. So we're going to open the floor to a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions at all, we're going to move on to that now. Is someone going around with a mic? Sorry, I don't know if that's... Oh, okay. Yeah, go for it. It's on.
Hi, amazing talk. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm a fairly young trans person myself. I'm 23, and I've been involved in my university's like LGBT association for the too many years that I've been at university now. And I feel like I'm seeing an increasing amount of like carceral mindsets within younger people who are coming into university and the association, both in terms of a carcerality of gender, in terms of what identity is meant to look like, how like what symbols you're meant to use, how you're meant to describe yourself, but also in terms of how we should approach people who have done various types of harm within spaces. And I don't know, I guess I'm tempted to blame that on TikTok and Instagram infographics, but I don't know how accurate that is. And I wonder if you have any sort of thoughts about that and if that's something you've witnessed yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a really hard question. It really, really is. There is a very, to me, prominent strain of a kind of carceral feminism, which is simply to say kind of feminism and gender justice that seeks to rely on carceral measures and institutions as a way to promote gender justice, even though incarceration, prisons, et cetera, those kinds of institutions deeply promote and are the causes of a whole bunch of gender violences. So it's really hard to try to think outside of that, to imagine outside of that. And I think the one thing that I'll say, there are other things that many other people who are phenomenal could say. And one of the texts I would recommend is a recently published book called Feminism, Abolition Now, which is by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Beth Ritchie, and a fourth person whose name I'm forgetting. But they do a phenomenal job of thinking through the complexities of this. But one of the things I will say is, I think in spaces like that, in activist spaces, especially student-led spaces, one of the things we might do is to emphasize this care, to emphasize how do we want to live with and among one another, even with people who do harm, which can be all of us in varying degrees, of course. It's not to flatten that. But if we all do harm, or since we all do some kind of harm, how can we care for one another, both in the kinds of the ways that people who are survivors of that harm need to be held and cared for, but also how do we think about the ways that harm is enacted via other modes of harm that people might have faced. So this is not at all to absolve people of the impact that they have on other people, but rather to think more capaciously and broadly about the impact that various social systems, various kind of discourses, various histories have on us in the way that we feel we are allowed to act. Because I would also perhaps assert that harm that is caused to other people might sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, be about a lack of recognition or a lack of knowing that there are other ways to be, other ways to interact with people. So all the ways that we might perpetrate certain kinds of harm of varying degrees, in many ways are a kind of a horizon of stanched possibility for how we understand it possible to relate to other people. So I would like to emphasize that in these kinds of spaces, because what I found in very similar spaces that people are deeply, deeply trying to mitigate harm done, mitigate oppressive structures and injustices, are very desperately trying to do that. If we emphasize the other ways that harm looks, I think we might be able to expand what we might understand as justice, as the mitigation of those harms. So none of that's really concrete, of course, but I'm hoping that that allows us to move differently in relation to other people, which is always my emphasis. How do we move in relation to other people differently, such that they feel more possible, such that they feel cared for more, et cetera? So I hope that answers the question. Thank you. Other questions folks have, and also don't feel like you have to ask a question too. There's a kind of a expectation sometimes during these Q&A sessions that you feel like you have to ask a question right now. You can always feel free to email me, reach out to me, come up to me after this. All of that's also perfectly okay, because some people don't like to ask questions in front of large crowds. I count myself in that. So if you want to ask a question in a different kind of way at a different time, that's also okay. But if there are questions, please.
Hi, thank you. Dr. Sarah Taylor, she, her. I'm very curious as to, I mean, everything you've said, it sounds very gracious and kind and respectful, but where do the emotions like anger and rage and frustration fall into this dynamic when our spaces are constantly intruded upon, our identities are constantly denied? Where do we have the space within what you have said to be able to express our rage and anger and frustration?
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that. And all of it, Because for me, I mean, I am deeply a student as well of Black feminist theory. And one of the things, of the many things that I've learned from Black feminism is the way that anger is a critical practice. Anger is a critical disposition. That the things that we feel angry about are insights into the kinds of mechanisms that are working. So I said this literally to my grad students in the class that I'm teaching last week, that we need to bring our emotions, our affects to these things precisely because those are the things that are telling us what's happening. So in everything, I think, in the most profound moments of love, of care for people, we can be pissed off with them. And I think that is a deeply valid, even though, I mean, I feel a type of way about that word, and the way that that word is kind of pervasive now that everything is valid, but we can talk about that later. But I mean, I think it is deeply valid for one to be angry, for one to, in fact, not want to be near someone or in proximity to someone. But I think that also has within it a level of care and love, precisely because it is attentive to and in service of a different kind of population that they might understand as more marginalized, more vulnerable, more precarious. And so for someone to be angry with someone else, I think is not simply that I am angry with you, but rather that I am angry with you because I care for other kinds of people that you harmed, which can include ourselves. So anger, I think, is deeply endemic to all of these things. How it manifests, of course, and the effect that it has, of course, all of that stuff is up for a conversation as well, the impact of that. But nevertheless, anger, rage, other kinds of affective states are absolutely a part of this and need to be a part of this. It's not all roses ever, really, but how we want to express and articulate the things that we feel and think can very well look like anger and other kinds of emotional and affective states that don't feel good to other people, and that is entirely okay. I think it's absolutely necessary too.
Hi, Alana Mortlock. I am currently writing my PhD thesis about Black feminist thought and trans feminisms, and I've been thinking a lot about the concept of fugitivity and movement. And then as you were speaking and talking about this relationship between trans-radicality and abolition, I was really struck by kind of that contrast between the fugitive and fugitivity and the carceral state, or carcerality as a political mindset, although that's not quite the right word. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on this fracture between movement and fugitivity and the kind of solidification that comes through carcerality.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So the discourse of fugitivity is one that I fell in love with a number of years ago. I absolutely fell in love with. So to give a real quick definition for folks who aren't familiar with that terminology, for me, I come to it by way of Black studies, by way of the kind of history of Blackness with respect to various forms of captivity and capture. And the definition that I always return to, because it's the most succinct and clear one, is by a Black feminist scholar named Tina Campt, who says that fugitivity is the quotidian practice of refusal. And I really like that definition because it's not simply resistance, but rather it's refusal, which has a different kind of valence, I think, that is subtler, that is more sly, perhaps. So the relationship I see between, say, fugitivity and, say, the carcerality or the carceral state is one where if carcerality is understood, at least I understand it in this way, as a pervasive and insistent mode of capture and captivity, fugitivity then serves as a kind of indexing of what are the various ways, because it can look a whole bunch of different ways, but what are the various ways we can undermine, interrogate, get outside of, decline to even agree to the terms and conditions of such a mode of carcerality. And for me then, it is a mode of Black feminism, of Black trans feminism. And I get this from a person named Jennifer Nash, who is also a friend and wonderful, wonderful person who understands Black feminism as an anti-captivity project. And that to me is a deeply fugitive practice because it's seeking in any kind of realm we can find how we might imagine in excess of and outside of various modes of capture, which look, of course, like, say, the enslavement of someone or the relegation of someone's self-determination to various medical, juridical institutions. But it can also look a whole bunch of different ways, which is why I try to emphasize the different ways that we might care for one another, that we might do this kind of politics. And so, succinctly, fugitivity's relationship to carcerality and the carceral state is one that is always an attempt to refuse the very logics of carcerality by way of interrogating, undermining, getting outside of, exceeding those modes of captivity. Other questions folks have? Yeah, there's one right here. I don't know who has the mic.
I just wanted to really thank you as someone who works in
Thank
a
you.
domestic abuse service. So for full transparency, we're funded by the Police and Crime Commissioner to support queer survivors of domestic abuse. And I feel
That's
that to be a
interesting.
massive tension between my own practice as someone who deeply believes in anti-carcerality and kind of emancipatory practices, and the fact that we're provided money by a carceral institution, I guess, that the only investment in our existence is to help us help queer people report to the police, essentially. And I find that to be a real tension. It's really important to think about that in terms of that the resources all seem to go to helping trans and marginalised people support the police, and not instead to helping us heal and helping perpetrators to heal. Because I know that, you know, a lot of the reasons that perpetrators say, I haven't done anything wrong, is because once you admit that you have done something wrong, you're criminalized. You know, so many marginalized survivors don't speak out because they're worried that their partner, that their loved one, that the person who's harmed them is going to get killed in prison or harmed in prison. And so it's a real tension for me in the work that I do, and I just kind of wanted to thank you for having this conversation, and also wonder, how can I in my practice help to undo those harms that I know are being done just by the way that we're funded, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I will say too, it's a very, very tricky, thorny situation to be in. I think a generous reading of that funding might be that this is generous. We can quibble over this, but might be that they're not giving us money, but we are taking that money and using it and disseminating it for the ends that will ultimately dissolve that very source of funding. So maybe we can look at it in that way if we're trying to be a little bit more generous. But in terms of how to eradicate various kind of modes of harm that we see, that we might even participate in, that we might be privy to, all that kind of stuff. It's really difficult. It's really, really difficult, which I know is nothing new. We know this, but it is. But I think one of the things I'll say, and this is not practical advice, but this is more affective, an affective suggestion, invitation, is to demonstrate a level of patience and kindness with ourselves. We can see a theme and thread moving through the things that I say. I'm very much someone who is very committed to a kind of love politics, as my dear friend Vivaran Chaudhry understands it. But how can we be kinder and more patient with ourselves? Because that too, to presume that, to whatever extent this is true, to presume that we need to be perfect in these ways and we need to never allow anything bad to happen, or we are not doing the kind of work that we're doing. None of this is to say that this is what you're saying, but I do think this is sometimes how people feel, sometimes how I feel. That to me is actually a carceral gesture, that we're not permitted to make mistakes, that if we do make a mistake, then we are penalized for that. I want us to be kinder to ourselves, which I'm hoping will then contaminate other people or the spaces that we're in, if we can be kind to ourselves. Because I think one of the things among many things, one of the things that make people feel that they cannot be accountable to the kinds of harms that they do is precisely because they don't feel that they'll be held in how to be accountable. They feel that they'll be exiled and excommunicated, so they shy away from trying to be accountable because they don't want to lose those tethers to people. So if we can demonstrate a sense of holding and caring for other people, even in the moments that they are harmed, which also does not exclude the people who are survivors of that harm, how can we maintain that kind of ethic for all people who are involved in the various kind of ravages of the ways that harm moves through us and on us? So demonstrating kind of patience and kindness for ourselves, I think is one of the things that we might do, because that can have an affective effect, a transformative effect on that. Because I'm deeply someone who is an advocate for and votary for transformative justice and the possibilities of transformation. So I'm hoping that kind of affective and emotional politics can then seep into the spaces that we find ourselves to allow us to be accountable to various kinds of harms that we might feel or that other people might feel are reasons to shy away from trying to be accountable. But it's difficult work. It's really difficult work, but it is sustained and long-standing work that is done in community, that is done in relation to other people, which I think is absolutely key, absolutely key. So thank you so much for that. Other questions that folks have? And if not, that's okay too. We can try to get a little closer to being back on schedule. Like the question over here.
Oh, that was wonderful, your talk. I so enjoyed it. It feels really nourishing to be talking about things like love and needing to care for ourselves and other people. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah, I was just about to ask, could you speak more into the mic?
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me now? I think it's really important that we talk about an ethics of care and also that openness to different diversities and possibilities going forward, that things are not just foreclosed. But I also have a question for you about that movement between the sort of utopia and that more loving space that you've really highlighted, you know, and the reality of the structural discriminations and the aggressions and microaggressions that we're facing, and how to really move between those. And I think that that's been indicated by one or two of the other questioners. And I imagine it's not that you're saying that we might not need to take very robust action at times, you know, whether that's, you know, taking cases to court or tackling bigoted politicians or protecting ourselves physically if we get attacked. I imagine that is correct. But that what you're talking about is more that we need that broader compassion at the same time as laying down those boundaries in a really robust way. And I just wondered if you might want to talk around that a bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not saying that everything is utopic or that we shouldn't take certain kinds of actions in certain kinds of scenarios. I think you're absolutely right about that. I think what I want to try to emphasize is the importance of and existence of a constant struggle in the things that we're doing, and how that struggle, I think, or I want to be in community with other people. So one of the primary or prominent ways that say more robust action is taken is by, say, calling the police or wanting for someone to be jailed or something like that. I think what I want to do is not at all to say that we don't need to struggle in the pain that we feel, the harm that we feel, or the harm that we perpetrate, but rather how can we continue to sit with the very complex ways that those kinds of dynamics play out, and how can we do that in community with one another. It's not about relegating a certain kind of punishment to a harm doer or to say various kinds of institutions for the harm doer or for various harm doers or people who have harm moving through them, but rather how can we continue to sit and struggle in community with people who we care about, who care about us too. That's the thing, and that's like, just talk to people who do transformative justice work. It is so hard. Like, people can be in mediations for hours and hours and still not have things resolved. And it's not necessarily about coming to a particular resolution everyone feels okay and happy, but rather how can we continue to know that people are open to, or that it's possible for people to transform and be transformed in order for or in service of a more just relationship with people. And that is difficult work. That's very, very difficult work. And sometimes people get tired. Sometimes people get tired and have to say, I can't do this right now or for a while. So someone else might have to take up that work. But that's the thing that I want to insist on. It's quite far from utopic, actually, as I articulate it now. It's quite far from utopic. But I do think it's messier, which I think is perhaps even what we deserve more on that messiness, because that is a testament to the messiness of us, and also the ways that we need things to be more complex than simply this person did a bad thing, they go to jail, and everything is good. That is, to me, deeply fallacious. So how can we continue to struggle with one another in community, in relation, and perhaps to try to heal those relations? Because it's not, because for me, it's about how can we promote healing, and that happens to me in community, in a kind of a transformative practice that is self-reflective, but also community accountable. So I hope that answers the question. Wonderful, thank you. Any other final questions? Oh, there are hands back there. I think that's just them letting us
Hi,
know that.
hi, yeah. We have a question from Carmen Clark online, and says, this is probably a basic question. The subject is new to me, so I would like to ask, what is meant by a carceral mindset in this context?
Oh, wonderful question. I love those kind of fundamental questions that always make me acknowledge the moments when I might just be assuming that everyone knows this thing. So carceral mindsets. I'm trying to think of an example. As I said, I'm quite philosophically oriented. I want to try to make this as concrete as possible. So I'm understanding carcerality as any kind of mechanism of attempting to capture or circumscribe or jail, police, punish, discipline people or behaviors for various reasons that then depart from particular normative mainstream status quo criteria. If that's carcerality, then carceral mindsets are ones that presume that justice is served, or that harm is reduced, or that violence is reduced by exiling and punishing and disciplining people. That's carceral mindset, and that serves as a kind of that serves in opposition to a kind of abolitionist mentality that does not dispose of anyone, or that also does not presume that people are irredeemable, but that is very insistent on the possibilities, the radical possibilities of transformation. So how can we then not necessarily think that this person or this act is irredeemable, but rather how can we try to sit with the messiness of that and think about the possibilities for healing rather than simply trying to get rid of a person? How can we think instead about trying to transform the ways that people move, the ways that society manifests, and how can we then in that promote healing? So that's just a really, really quick primer on carceral mindsets, transformative justice, abolition, and I hope that answers the person's question. Any final thoughts from folks? Another hand over here.
Hi, sorry, it's me again. So I'm very curious. I want to follow on from this carceral mindset dynamic. I mean, because the systems that we have in place that we most often communicate with each other with, we use Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. I mean, effectively, the carceral mindset would be, no, it's good that they're permabanned. Because they've been exiled from the community, they've been exiled from those people. So effectively, and those kind of people who are so outraged, that so outrage even conservative institutions like Facebook or such passive and permissive groups like Twitter would still be reinforcing a carceral mindset and our support. So this is effectively the kind of dynamic, the approach that you take to it. I do find that somewhat problematic. And the reason why is because often we form smaller communities to retreat from. I'm thinking about Carmichael and Hamilton's talking about Black consciousness, those kind of dynamics of retreating from, so that we can have a place where we are no longer exposed to the burns of the world around us. And to then have that intruding on the world outside, intruding on that needs to be exiled. I think I'm not sure that the way you're describing it is accommodating the hierarchical dynamics between larger and smaller. It sounds like you're approaching that from a very individualized way of kind of like an individual person shouldn't be exiled. But I think it would be helpful to kind of like have more clarity of the power dynamic, so we can understand in a more practical way the carceral mindset that we take on and when actually sometimes the protectionist nature of ourselves needs to take hold first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I don't intend for this to be individualistic at all. Really, I'm deeply invested in coalition and solidarity. Because for me, a carceral mindset is not specific to an individual. It's not specific to one's individual psychology. But these are systems and histories, discourses, and relations that affect people. So that's the thing that I want to try to think more deeply about. And in the context of, say, communities that want to retreat from or get away from these various systems that are doing harm, that to me, I don't think that's at all kind of exiling, but rather it's an attempt to, that's precisely an attempt to heal from these various institutions, histories, discourses, violences, et cetera. That to me, in fact, is a way to care for oneself, to care for one's community. Is deeply community oriented and deeply one that is attempting to both heal, but also think critically and deeply about what are the things we need to do in order to make it possible that perhaps we don't need to do this right here. If it is a way to get away from all these harm, how can we in these moments of our healing, when we feel less violated, how can we then utilize that as a space where we can finally think about the things that we and others might need to do in order to mitigate these things that make this space right here necessary. And that to me is an anti-carceral and abolitionist practice, deeply so. So I do apologize for implying that this was deeply individualistic, because for me it's not. It's very much coalitional, very much in community with other people. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Hello? Hello,
Yeah.
sorry. I have another question online from Alice Forbes, and she said, would acts of mutual aid to our local communities be seen as a kindness/healing mindset?
Yes, mutual aid. I mean, there's not much I can say outside of Dean Spade's wonderful book, Mutual Aid. Like that, I mean, I don't want to say really anything, just like to go read that book if you have the capacity to do that. Read Mutual Aid by Dean Spade. Dean Spade is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, in all the things that Dean does. So that text, I think, is one that really crystallizes the ways that mutual aid is a part of such a radical project that I am in part talking about. So that book, Dean Spade, Mutual Aid, is just what I will say in response to that. We have 5 minutes or so. There's a hand up here.
I'm not quite sure how to formulate my thoughts, but
okay.
Some of these concepts are quite new to me. I'm not an academic as such. I guess that on some levels I do embody the carceral mindset that you're describing. And you're like this kind of really beautiful, graceful speaker, that you have such kind of kindness and love. And yet, some of what you're saying kind of makes me angry. And you know, as you say, I should interrogate that feeling and see kind of where it's coming from. I think part of it is that it seems as though a lot of the work that has to be done to reconcile those people who are perpetrating harm with everybody else has to be done on the part of those people who are receiving the harm. And that does not seem fair. And I guess I'm someone that I get very cross about things being fair and kind of people being hurt, and like people need to know that's bad because they're not allowed to. Apparently I'm 12. And it seems like a beautiful abstract concept that I just don't see how it can translate when you have people, you know, people like politicians who are so embedded in their privilege, they don't have any need to realize the harm that they're causing. They don't want to. They're not interested in that because it doesn't serve them in the slightest way. And I want their privilege to be removed. I want them to stop enjoying that position and their ability to perpetrate harm. I would like them to be exiled. I would like them to be excommunicated. I don't necessarily think they're redeemable. And there are some people that commit acts of, physical or sexual violence that, with the best will in the world, I'm not always convinced they're redeemable. And I know it's complicated, and I know that people do these acts. There's a kind of, it's not even a spectrum, it's a kind of constellation. They have harm perpetrated on them, and then they perpetrate harm. And I know it's complicated, but I do still feel like, despite our system being incredibly broken, there are many harms being perpetrated by it, and there are many ways in which it's not being, it's perpetrating its own harms and it's not helping. I still end up with the feeling that there are some people that the amount of work that you would have to put in to redeem them is simply not worth it. And maybe that's harsh, I don't know. There are a set of complicated thoughts there. I'm not sure there's a single question, but.
Yeah, that's okay. One of the things I do want to say this too. One of the things I hear in all that you've expressed, and I'm so grateful for that, is this grappling with it, and that's one of the only things I can ask for to continue to do, because what you're doing right now is part of that work. That's part of the work of trying to think really deeply about what are the things that you're feeling, what are the things that you're encountering and seeing, and why do you feel those ways. So I appreciate that so much. This is a longer conversation, of course, absolutely, and we can continue to talk about these things. I think what I'll say though is, I'll quote. I enjoy quoting people because I learn from other people. So I want to kind of pay an homage to the people who have gifted me with certain kinds of knowledges. My dear friend, comrade, homie, Kai M. Green, who literally has done and continues to do transformative justice work. So survivors of various kinds of harm are literally sitting in the room or not sitting in the room with people who perpetrated harms, and those kinds of processes, what that is like. When I said that these processes can take like hours sometimes and things are still not resolved, I'm literally thinking about a conversation that I had with Kai about that. So one of the things that Green says, and I like these pithy little statements that allow us to think, is that people do monstrous things, but no one is a monster. And that's hard to believe. It really, really is, because you see people continue to do monstrous things, and you understand them then as, yeah, you're a monster. But I think the aim then is to understand that the kind of acts that people do, or the ways that people think, or the things that people do, those things come from somewhere. They're not endemic to, they're not inherent to them, as if it's simply the way that they are. I want us to commit to thinking about the possibility of what would it take, and it will take a lot sometimes, it will absolutely take a lot sometimes, but what would it take to allow for room for people who do perpetually monstrous things, to provide or to cultivate space for trying to eradicate those things rather than eradicate the person. How do we eradicate those things that also happen to them, by which I mean these discourses and sensibilities of harm? Those things happen to that person as well. How can we attempt to eradicate those things such that to commit a certain kind of harm to someone is rendered like this is not even a possibility for someone to feel? And again, I want to note that the labor that goes into trying to eradicate those modes of harm is intense, is absolutely intense. It is not the job of one person or two people or three people, certainly not the job of the people who are on the receiving end of those harms, absolutely not. All these kinds of things are deeply survivor-led, are deeply community-led, and I think that's the thing that we need to emphasize first and foremost, and then moving from there. So it's not simply that this person or these people who are survivors of various kinds of harm, but rather how do we attend to what people who are on the receiving end of harm, what do they need in order for healing? Have a conversation about that, open up a conversation and a practice about that, and then moving from there in ways that insist on the possibility of transforming the existence of, or the continued or future existence of, these harms that happen to this person. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And I don't know, I think for me, it's part of an ethical relationship to everyone that I'm not interested in disposing of anyone. I'm deeply, deeply not interested in that. And that will look very different for some people as opposed to other people. How we relate to people that we don't want to dispose of does not always have to look the same. But I want to try to commit to the possibility of it's possible for people to be transformed. That is difficult work, but I do think it's possible, and I think that's part of an ethics of. I think that's part of an ethics of care. I think that's part of an ethics of trying to engender a more just world that is inclusive of everyone who has suffered or been subject to various kinds of harm, and I think that includes people who do harm in various kinds of ways. Again, a longer conversation, of course, and one that takes time too, and also one that we can disagree too on things. I'm not so interested in trying to bludgeon people with this is what I think, but what I'm interested in is trying to be in relation and conversation with people. So I deeply, deeply appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I'm getting the signal that we are out of time, but there are people who have hands up. Feel free to come up to me afterward, email me, we can talk about these things. This is an ongoing conversation. So I appreciate all of you so very much. Thank you so much for all of this.